Hey, Michael, Nate, I'm really happy to be back here again to be talking about radical orthodoxy as we try to make our way through this and figure out what it all means. And today we're on episode number 6. So I'm going to just read paragraph 6 out of the 7 principles. So without God, people see a nullity at the heart of things. They regard death as more real than life. This means that body gets hollowed out and abstraction becomes the true permanent reality, as in all is decay. Only a belief in transcendence and a participation in transcendence actually secures the reality of matter and the body. God transcends body, but is, as it were, even more body than body. So radical orthodoxy insists on a valuation of the body, sexuality, the sensory, and the aesthetic, while affirming also that an ascesis, which seeks always to rise from body to the source of body, is necessary to preserve this valuation. I take that ascesis is the same root word as asceticism.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So without God, people see a nullity at the heart of things. What do you make of that?
Yeah. I think that ties into what we were talking about a lot in our last discussion. That really I don't really see, like, absent a grounding in the infinite. I don't see a way to avoid nihilism. So if you're only grounded in the finite, I think nihilism is where you inevitably end up. So that would make it that there really would be a nullity at the heart of things. So that means that it becomes impossible to root value or meaning or anything that we intuitively want, desire.
Yeah, I think the alternative would only be the sort of Nietzschean Darwinian, I don't know, will to power, survival at all costs. There's just those who win and those who lose, in terms of that kind of ultimate genetic survival, I guess. And in that version of events, somebody like Genghis Khan, who has his genes populated around the world, he wins, and Jesus, who had no genetic information of his spread around the world, loses.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm always thinking about these things from the standpoint of how it scales all the way down and then scales all the way back up again. And I think at the heart of everything in the universe, I used to think it was that boundaries define everything in the universe and keep one thing from being another thing. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think that there has to be at the heart of each thing a center that is drawing towards itself what that thing is supposed to be. And at the same time, there is a thing outside that there, it's always this inside and outside. There's an inside and there's an outside to everything. And the inside is pulling in and the outside is pulling out. And it's between those two things that the form becomes filled. And so if you lose the center and everything just starts moving out, then it's just going to keep moving out. And that's why things are getting so atomized. And this is why ideas are getting so atomized, because if a philosophy or if a way of thinking loses its center, like in the United States, our center used to be the principles of the Constitution. And that's what kept us together. And that's why we didn't need walls. But when you lose the center and everything just starts blowing away, just floating up into the atmosphere. I was thinking about this wonderful quote that Nate sent us about Bulgakov, when he looked at all the different religious traditions in Europe, and then he finally came to the Cathedral of Sophia and how beautiful it was. And so,
Oh, that was Bulgakov was relating the sort of classical story of how the Russian people became Orthodox.
oh, okay.
So
Okay.
he's actually talking about the tale of like of how Vladimir the Great like brought Orthodoxy to Russia. But yeah, but the point is that it's beauty, right? It's the beauty, the actual like architecture of Hagia Sophia that made its impression upon. So rather
Right.
than
So, but what I wanted to say here was, I'm just going to read a little bit from that thing you sent us. It says,
sure.
Bulgakov's experience echoed that of these first witnesses. His happiness was boundless. God had not let him die without a vision of Saint Sophia as something absolute, self-evident, and irrefutable. It was the most marvelous of churches. Human tongue could not express its lightness, clarity, inner transparency, and wonderful harmony. This is indeed Sophia, the real unity of the world in the Logos, the co-inherence of all with all, the world of divine ideas. And I think that's such a powerful and beautiful concept, but also if the inside and the outside come to a place where they're not matching anymore, if I think of myself, if I become all wrapped up in this divine world of ideas, which is what can easily happen. I can get so all up in my head in this divine world of ideas, and I'm just living in this cathedral of beauty all around me. But I risk floating off and just getting lost up there in those ideas if I'm not also participating in the world. That's the tether, right? It's that participation with others where I have to face the reality of my own sin and weakness and stupidity and nasty temper and selfishness, and that's where I face that with all these other people, and that's part of the tether that keeps me from just blowing off into space. And that it's that core that when we lose that core, and if we don't have God, we don't have that core because we don't understand why it is that we're participating with others and what we have to learn there. Does that make any sense? That was a lot of
Well,
weird stuff.
yeah. Only have matter. If you only have matter, it's hard to even justify a concept like beauty, because if everything is matter, then there is a fundamental sameness to everything. You lose all sense of relationality
Mm-hmm.
if everything is reducible to matter. And I would also say that the connection between God and beauty is that our primary access to beauty is through the world of sensible things. So the beauty shines forth in the creation and calls us toward its source. So you can't really it I don't know if you really can have a conception of beauty that doesn't in some way connect to the sensible world. So it can never be limited to ideas. You can have like it can spark something on the, you're talking about the inside and the outside, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that experience of beauty in the sensible world can spark something on the inside that, you know, draws you toward this internal experience. But like those things are always connected to one another,
Mm-hmm.
just as matter and form are always connected to one another. And I would like in fact the actual like the only way to have individuated things is by form.
Right.
Right? Without form, then there's no individuation. Everything would just be formless matter.
And I struggle so much to conceptualize what that form is, because in somewhere in my mind that form is some sort of substructure or skeleton or matrix of something that has connectors on it. It has the connectors built in before the thing begins to form. Just the way my personality had connectors when I was born already.
Yeah, what St. Augustine says is that it actually is that matter like has the capacity to receive form. So that kind of connects to what you were saying right there.
Yeah, capacity.
So the matter has the capacity to receive form, but until the matter receives the form, we can't, we don't really know what it is, and we don't know how it relates to other forms either, right? So that's where this concept of relationality comes in too. It's like and the forms, horizontally participate with one another, and vertically participate in the good or God, as well, simultaneously.
Yeah, so I was thinking about how it all comes down at a certain point, it all comes down to love. That love is what creates the telos of everything. And the reason I say that is, again, if I look at my own experience in the world as being scalable, because I believe that we can learn about the world from ourselves and how we relate to the world. The scripture says, love God with all your heart and soul, mind and soul and strength, heart and soul and strength. One of those things. And love your neighbor as yourself. So out of that, kind of the whole plan just falls out. I mean, it just starts to stack up, because if I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, then that means I have to love myself. And how on earth do I love myself? The only way I can love myself is if I understand that God loves me and he created me for his purposes, and then my whole identity spools out of that sense of his love for me, and that I therefore must learn to love myself so that I can learn to love my neighbor. Jordan Peterson said that Adam and Eve had this psychological awakening when they realized how a human being could be injured, that was the awakening, learning how they can be. So if you know how you can be injured, you know how to injure other people. The same way, when you know how you can be loved and how you can love yourself, then you can learn to love other people. So I think everything comes out of that love and what love actually means. And I looked up agape in the Greek and I was so surprised. It's what God prefers. What on earth,
Right.
So that's like what
that's
God
that's the ultimate ground level of it, what it means.
Well, I'd have to look it up again, but that was in the Greek definition of it. Is agape means that which God prefers. So he's always drawing towards himself. That's what agape is. It's his drawing to himself, that love. I don't know. It's deep stuff, man. And in that DC Schindler video, he said, in love, the object is not made to the measure of our desire, but rather our desire is made to fit the measure of the object. So, which took me right away to Psalm 37:4, Lord, give me the desires of my heart. That was what I'm thinking that verse says. And I went back and reminded myself, no, it says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And I can remember the day in 1982 when I was driving to graduate school on a snowy road. It was a 52-mile drive every day. And I was thinking about a lot of things that were very negative. And then I remembered that verse, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And I just had this epiphany. Well, he's not going to give me what I want. He's going to change the desires of my heart so that I desire the same things for myself and for him that he desires for me and for him and for others. So I looked up delight today in the Hebrew, and you're not going to believe what it means. It's so weird. It means to be soft and pliable or delicate. It's used quite often as delicate in the Old Testament, but I like more the soft and pliable because that means yielded, right? And the reason I thought that was so cool was that Sunday night at Bible study, we had the verse, count it all joy when you experience trials of various kinds. And one of the guys said, I just don't get how I can count it joy. So I'm sitting there in Bible study and I looked up the Greek for joy. And it means to lean towards or to have a positive disposition towards, which I think also means this kind of idea of yielded. So when we yield ourselves to what we can learn in the suffering, that's what it means to count it all joy. It doesn't mean, oh, yay, I'm suffering. It means I can lean into that and learn what's there for me. And
Yeah,
that's all tied in somehow with this idea of love and getting hollowed out.
so I think, you know, what you were talking about there, both in terms of the pliability and in terms of what D.C. Schindler talks about, the appetite or the desire being shaped to the thing that's being loved.
Mhm.
What that brings to my mind immediately is creation itself. That you know, it says in 1 John, this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us.
Yep.
And so there's, for me, there's this, again, this initial, I don't know, kenosis or self-emptying love that is present in the creative act itself. And it is, I know there's something in my own thinking, I just keep tripping over again and again and again, which is that there's some cost that God comes to bear the moment he comes into relationship with finitude. There's something, and I don't know that we'll ever, maybe not even in eternity, be able to fathom what that cost is. But I think again, the cross is intended to kind of give us a picture of it in time. But again, Jesus is the lamb slain before the foundation of the world in some sense. And then all things were created through him and nothing was made without him. So, you know, which the church fathers take up into this idea, and even in John itself, the idea of the logos, right? Which is sent forth. Yeah, I don't know. There's something just really kind of deep about the nature of reality. Cause you know, as I was talking about with Matthew the other day, I see these ideas of redemption and beauty and pain and the necessity of pain and suffering all being kind of tied intricately together into the nature of God's love for us. And, you know, in one of our previous conversations, you know, with, I think it was the three of us with Matt, and he was talking about this sort of love that draws us out. And I do think, and I think it's St. Dionysius that even just uses this language to describe God, that there is this eros, there is this desire, there is this attraction to beauty that draws himself. He loves the cosmos. For God so loved the cosmos that he sent his only son. There's something about, there's the beauty in what he set out to do draws him out of himself to pay this enormous cost.
Who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, so that he could sit down at the right hand of God the Father. And how did you put it, Michael? The beauty draws him.
out of himself. I mean, like, because something happens in creation that I think is deeply connected to the cross.
Don't we know from our own experience that that the act of creation, even human creation, always involves a pouring out of the self? Is there really any other way to create?
Yeah, and this is something I thought about too, in terms of, like, in terms of narratives and structures. I've often thought about what makes a story good or bad, especially when I'm watching a film or something, and I'm finding myself taking pleasure in it, or I'm criticizing it in some way. I often think about what's going on, what principle am I using to judge this? And one of the things that I find I'm often using is how much are the writers sacrificing themselves for the characters? Like, how much are they allowing the characters to have a real life versus, oh, this side character here only exists to get the main character from point A to point B. And let's say within a fictional work, does the characters have a free will? And you could say, we'd probably say, if it's a story we wrote, they don't. But I would say, to some degree, they do have degrees of freedom, and the degree to which those freedoms exist as a direct act of self-sacrifice on the part of the writer, the author, who allows that character to take up additional residency inside their personhood, and gives it life, and breathes into it, gives it attention, gives it care, gives it agape, like, and gives it a sort of telos, a completion.
Right. This is interesting. I was just reading some of Adrian Papp's metaphysics. Attention. And Saint Augustine in the Musica suggests that because of the nature of participation and relationality, that the telos of things is not fixed. It's not a fixed target. But it's actually it's something that can shift and move as we move through space and time. And the same would apply, I think, beyond just individual things, but to like the creation itself. And I don't know if that connects to what you were trying to articulate about, like, what it costs God in creation to begin with. But I haven't really, it's just like this little seed of an interesting idea that I haven't even had a chance to like fully think about.
Yeah.
But
well, let me throw something in here that I just heard the other day, and I'm not sure if it was in this tape between Jordan Peterson and Ian McGilchrist, or if it was something else I was listening to, but whoever it was talking about God at the instant of creation, before the world came into being. He had to withdraw a little bit in order to make space. Before space and time existed, when God began to speak the worlds into being, his first act was to withdraw a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure if he's getting that biblically from the text, because before I started blabbing,
there's something there at the beginning that's formless and without void, right? And now, depending on what,
depends on how you read text. And I would say, because in the beginning God created.
Mhm.
So I mean, certainly, like, the Orthodox view is that creation happens from nothing. So you wouldn't have any pre-existent formless matter like you would in pagan antique view.
Right.
So
yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I would say, but I think some people,
because that first verse, we don't know how much time takes place between "in the beginning God created" and from that
Right.
phrase to "the earth was without form and void."
Right.
A lot of things can happen in between. In the beginning, God created, and then the
So
rest.
I just want to make sure that we were acknowledging. I didn't want someone to come away with the assumption that that the matter pre-existed the act
Oh
of
no,
creation.
no.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm trying to avoid, is that the matter is. I was talking about formless matter earlier, so I'm not denying the possibility of like formless matter, but formless matter itself would have to be the result of God's creation.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And I
Well,
think that
Okay,
before
that's
the
all I wanted to
creation,
clarify.
there's also no time or space, right? There's no time,
Right.
no space, no matter. So
well, in some pagan, conceptions of this, certainly they do set this up as sort of a pre-existing thing, that the God who creates it can only do what he can because of this sort of lump of clay that he's given, and kind of has to shape it. There's a sort of limitation that's introduced just by the way that the story is framed.
Yeah. God lacks full transcendence in the pagan view, I would say.
Yeah. But even more so, like when people, I think, are reading, say, like Jordan Peterson, and they're trying to map, say, on some of these categories of chaos, and like, say, the Ouroboros, there's this sense of that there's something outside of God that is more fundamental than God himself, right? That they people can come away with, and I don't subscribe to that either, but I did find it interesting that what Karen was saying, which is this sort of pulling back. So like creation is, there's something, God makes room for creation. Like, and I think in some sense creation is within God, like in the sense that I don't see a model of creation in which creation gets imbued with some of God's energies such that it's kind of, wound up and can exist apart from
Right.
him.
Right. No, exactly. God sustains it in its being. It's not
Yeah.
like God is not the God. It's not a deist God that just is like, creates outside of time and then is done and just lets the thing go off on
Yeah.
its own.
And
God
in some sense,
perpetually sustains it in being.
yeah, in some sense, he is creating it second by second. Like there's
Correct.
a sort of ongoing creation.
Which is why Augustine can talk about the possibility of the telos of things shifting and not being fixed. Because if God is sustaining everything in being, then things can adjust to God in time.
well, that's the thing that permits us any sort of freedom of will, freedom of choice whatsoever, because we participate in transcendence when we err. We participate when we come to the limits of our knowledge, we bump up against reality and we have to recalibrate. So it's that space that allows us to try different things, and in that trying we are also changed in very fundamental ways before we find our way through. And all of that is part of our growth and development that makes each one of us completely unique. And
that's why that appealed to me so much, is because it's like, to me, it kind of points toward the right question for a Christian being: what does God want from me now, as opposed to what does God want from me in some absolute sense. It's like, what can I do for God in this moment with my life? How can I contribute to God's plan in this moment?
I think it was, who was it? So I think it's C.S. Lewis that says something like this, that maybe in God is only interested in now and eternity, and the demons are encouraged to kind of get their subjects thinking about either the past or the future, and to kind of dissociate from either the present moment or the eternal consequences of what they do in the present moment has.
Right, and which connects to circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning and what we talked about last week, which is why postmodernism, like a rejection of the notion of presence, is like a key to postmodern philosophy. It's like, because the possibility of there being some kind of genuine presence that's rooted in the infinite can only point toward God. And if you begin from wanting to reject God to begin with, which I would posit that both modernity and postmodernity ultimately are doing, then you would want to avoid that
Well,
and manipulate your arguments in such a way that you do.
Going back to what you said about this moment, I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with Jess, and we were talking about, what do we do now? Now that we've learned these things and we're in these conversations, what do we do now? And after I finished the conversation, wrapped it up, I thought about it and I thought, well, right now is when I speak the truth to my daughter, or right now is when I hug my husband and find out if he wants a cup of coffee. And right now is whatever the moment is where I need to live my life in service to others and dwelling richly in the Lord and abiding in him, whatever that looks like in this moment, that's what I'm supposed to be doing right now. And
That's what I can do right now. And it's like you string those moments together, and that equates to a Christian life. The more you can actually
still you have
those
to have
moments
those
together.
now moments, and you have to have the aim.
Correct.
Because the aim is
orientation.
The aim is what brings those moments into focus.
That's why sin is hamartia, right? It's like you're not even aiming at the right target. That's why it uses an archery term. So yeah, absolutely.
And I also wanted to say something about what Michael said about the demons are always trying to get you to focus on the past or the future. And I so resonate with that so much. But I have one particular picture that came up in my mind, and that was when I lived in Japan. I was a missionary, and my husband of 20 years had just told me that he was gay and he was leaving me. And of course, that meant that I couldn't receive the missionary funds anymore because I couldn't be telling people we're executing this mission. So I didn't have any income. And I had a little part-time job that I continued on, but that was not nearly enough to pay my rent. And so I had all these questions, what's going to happen, and I'd be walking to and from the train station to go to work. And in my head would be all these pictures of the disasters that were headed my way. And I just couldn't control my mind. And one day it was like the Lord just cut right through all that. And he said, very lovingly, he said, Karen, the devil doesn't know the future. Mm. Wow. And I was looking at all the possible futures that the devil was trying to get me to look at. And only way I could keep my mind in the present was to focus completely on who God is. And so I trained myself, or he trained me, in every moment to see whatever beauty I could see in the moment. Oh, look at that leaf that fell on the ground. How precious is the shape of it. Oh, look at the sun filtering through that tree. It's bringing so much light and beauty into my life. I had to do that moment by moment by moment, day after day, until finally it kind of broke through on me. I'm okay. God is here. He's got a plan, and he's beautiful and he's good. And I don't need to worry about these things.
I had to be hard, Karen. My mom went through that. My dad's gay, so I in my own life, I kind of my family's kind of been through that same experience. So I know that had to be hard on you. When you were talking, I had this earlier when I was going over just the text that we were going to be talking about today. I just had this thought about kind of the difference between modernity and how we should experience or relate to reality. And I was thinking about, how as modernity begins, we start to do things like to take butterflies and pin them to a board and like stare at them with a magnifying glass and look at them up close as if that's the best way of understanding what a butterfly is, as opposed to watching the butterfly in nature operating in its environment, being a part of the creation and experiencing its beauty. So yeah, definitely
Oh,
that's
that's
being focused on beauty is definitely the right mentality, because um that's how God talks to us most commonly. It's the most common language of God, is through the beauty of his creation, and that includes other people. And
mhm.
that includes other people. So
Well, and being able to see the beauty in other people,
yes,
because oftentimes that's a huge paradox. It has nothing whatever to do with physical beauty. And in
nothing.
fact, the physical characteristics of a person change immensely once you love them, you know?
Right.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Right.
And you can meet a person who, I mean, I often say you have to leave room for grace, because I have known people, and I myself have been and still am often just a disgusting creature. and,
Yeah.
and and I've met people like that, and yet when they come to know the Lord and he begins to work in them, they become so radiantly beautiful. So to judge a person for where they are in the moment is such a sad, pathetic thing to do, you know. And thankfully he also has grace towards us. So when we are ugly, wretched creatures in the moment, he still reaches out with love and redemption to bring us back into focus.
Yeah.
One of
Good.
Yeah. But that's all right. That's why I don't really. This is why in my own thought I don't really worry so much about. I don't worry so much about judgment, because the God the God that I love and know has already judged the creation. He's already declared it good. And even though it's fallen, he has continued to love it and move it forward toward him. And I have no doubt in his ability and desire to ultimately reconcile it with him.
one of the things that all this is pulling from me is, where you were talking about modernity and in those painting up of butterflies. Part of the kind of myth of modernism and the progress it envisions, part of what underlies it is a sort of progress that has no cost associated with it. It like in that pinning up the butterflies, there's all these costs associated with it, and real costs in terms of even your ability to understand things in a real way. But like there's this sort of precision and exactitude that thinks it can, and sort of I don't know, find a shortcut or a secret
Yeah.
to that kind of bypasses all this. Um, whereas, you know, again, I think the reality of the creation itself is this undergirding of love that has real cost at every second. Um, and I don't, and I know a lot of people are like, who are caught up in a classical theistic view that say, God, this concept of impassibility. I don't know how to conceptualize what these costs are, but I think, a lot of, like, when we get to Revelation and, like, the book of Revelation, you have all the saints singing these songs to God. I think those songs are built in a sort of revelation of how wonderful it is that God was able to tell this magnificent story, and what the risks. And I know we're not supposed to say God takes risks, but I don't know. I feel like there's a sense that, I don't know how to put this, but that we're just going to be amazed by the sort of I don't know, just the beauty of it, the grandeur of it, the and how much of God's own being he has invested in this project.
I don't know. To me, it seems pretty hard to make God not taking risk coincide with the kinds of people God is perpetually choosing. It seems like God is gambling on us all the time.
Yeah. I mean, you think about like a person you admire. You can't, like, let's say, you couldn't admire an Olympic sprinter for outrunning a child, at a picnic, right? You're not going to like, oh, wow, he's so fast. Like,
Right.
you admire the Olympic runner who goes and puts it on the line against something. And in some sense, I don't, I think, I don't think we're going to be worshiping a God who just kind of, snapped his fingers and papa, be impressed with me. I don't think that's the worship that's being described in the book of Revelation. It's a sort of, oh wow, I didn't
Right.
even know these depths. And I think, it's the sort of thing that we're going to have our fingerprints all over, but we're going to see the ways in which his involvement was deeper than we imagined.
And I don't think either the book of scripture or the book of nature tells us that story about God either. I mean, I don't think that's so.
Yeah, I think it is God's humility that sort of hides it. Where it talks about, it is the glory of God to hide a thing, and it's the glory of kings to search out a matter. I think there is something that's,
Mhm.
and that's part of the glory of it.
Absolutely.
Well, if we
Yeah.
go back to what Nate was saying earlier about at the heart of all creation, there is this, what you call it, loss or suffering or pain or darkness, but that's certainly true. When you think of the seed, which is sown corruptible and is raised incorruptible, you think about a garden seed that is put in the ground, covered with dirt, resting in the dark soil. The only way it can sprout is to decay a little bit and allow the outside to break off so that what is within can come forth up into the light. And you think about what a woman goes through in childbirth, and you just even think about what the womb goes, even just forget about the woman, just think about the womb itself that has to expand and expand and expand to give place for this baby. And that's all of that is tied in together. And so in a sense, when we look at any sort of thing that is created and this is true of art, it's true of music, any of these things, all of those are given to us as a picture of what the suffering of Christ was. So it's not, like Paul was saying the other day, that some people talk about, yeah, what's the big deal? He suffered for a few hours on the cross, and then he expects us to do all this stuff for him the rest of our lives. And it's like, no, it's not that at all. That suffering is at the core of the universe. That's what everything points to, and it's what everything comes from. And every single thing that we see in the world has that same pattern, and the pattern always points towards that narrowing and then coming back out again. So somehow, some way, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. So that joy set before him was the resurrection, was being there in order to save us and transform us. But that joy set before him was also just the joy of creation. Somehow that's all tied in there in that moment. I don't
Well,
think it's
I
3
think
hours.
I think I think if we toss away divine impassibility for a moment, I think that we can kind of avoid that objection to like, oh, he suffered for a few hours and that's it. Because I think, to me, if you take seriously the incarnation and realize that God is suffering on that cross, then it you are suffering for all time. And every moment of suffering is necessarily united to the suffering of God himself on that cross, in that ultimate act of emptying out of himself that mirrors the act of creation at the beginning, which ties back to what Michael was talking about the act of creation costing God something. The uniting of God to the material creation doesn't come at no price.
Well, and isn't there a verse? And when you do that, you crucify the Son of God afresh. Now, I can't remember what it is. Is it when you sin, when you can't remember the first part of the verse, so I shouldn't even be quoting it, but the second part of the verse is, you crucify the Son of God afresh. And certainly
Right. So yeah, our sins permanently. I mean, they're always wounding God. God is actually wounded by our sin.
Yes. And we are grieving the Holy Spirit. So
And it's not like, because it's that
I don't understand that.
he feels it's our pain that he's feeling when we do that, because he knows that by sinning we're bringing suffering upon ourselves, and it's like because he's invested and cares, it's not like he can just like that comes and like God's completely indifferent to it. No, God is the ultimate. God is the ultimate empath, right? It's like he really does. I don't know about Bill Clinton, but God really does feel your pain, like quite genuinely, in a very profound way, like in a way that you could never comprehend.
Yeah, and possibly much more, like almost certainly more than you can, just because it's just an issue of capacity,
Right?
You know, it's but he's also to see the good that's going to come out of the pain too. So it's sort of like, the kid that takes their child to get vaccinated. That they're with them in the pain, and they know in some sense a lot of times that the child can't comprehend what's happening to them, so they feel this sense of responsibility, but it's a part of the process. And likewise, there's other times, like where we sin, and at the moment we don't feel any pain at all. We're delighting in it,
Right.
and God
Yeah.
feels this pain because he knows what that is undoing, and the cost that we will incur moving out into the future, and that other people may be paying as a
which is why the telos always needs to be shifting. I think there's something fundamentally right about that. So
Okay, so yeah, you have
because
to
we're always undergoing change.
Because
Sure.
that doesn't necessarily mean that the telos is shifting. What that means is that our path to the telos is necessarily shifting.
Yeah.
Well, the ultimate, I'm talking about the telos of the individual. So like God's purpose for you, not God's purpose for creation. God's purpose for creation, God's purpose for creation is fixed and unchanging. But God's purpose for you is going to shift in time based on the choices, the free choices that you make. So what God might have done with you had you made different choices is kind of that's kind of gone and lost forever. That's in the past, which is you were talking about not dwelling on the past. This is why we should not dwell on the past.
Exactly.
We can't spend our time worrying about what might have been had we made different choices, and that would have allowed God to use us in a different way. We have to just be content with the best way that God can use us in this moment, with the choices the good and the bad choices that we made in our past.
Yeah.
And that those will shape our future.
Because if we give him these moments, even if they're moments of chaos and tragedy, he can make something good out of them. If we don't give it to him, it just is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in this here where it talks about, God transcends body, but is, as it were, even more body than body, I think there's an allusion there to those costs I'm talking about, because you think about what one of the things bodies do is they amplify all the risks being taken in the game being played. And there's this I don't know, there's something in here that I think is affirming God's identification with these things. Like,
well, let's go on to that sentence, because we got kind of hung up on the first sentence. So only a belief in transcendence and participation in transcendence actually secures the reality of matter and the body. So I think we got to that place. Then God transcends body, but is, as it were, even more body than body. So radical orthodoxy insists on evaluation of the body, sexuality, the sensory, and the aesthetic. Aesthetic, not ascetic, aesthetic. So what do you think they're getting at there when it says insists on evaluation of the body, sexuality, the sensory, and the aesthetic?
Well, I would say what it's focusing on is that we need to value like the bodily and the material. We don't want to turn Gnostic, right? We don't want to reject material embodiment as an evil. We want to accept it as a good, but neither do we want to make it the ultimate good. Which is why you still have room for ascesis, because that the purpose of that is to remind you, hey, this is good. It was created by God as good, but it's not the ultimate good. So you need to draw back from those things so they don't consume you and make you mistake them for the ultimate good. Like our telos is not limitless pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of suffering. It's something else.
So the self-discipline when it comes to how we use the body, how we feed the body, how we exercise the body, all of those things. Our self-discipline in regards to sexuality, how we allow the sensory to influence us for good or ill. And I think it's interesting that he also put the aesthetic in there, because I think there is a way that you can get too caught up in beauty. And I don't quite know how to put this into words, but a few years ago, there was an art show up at the museum in San Francisco, and it was of a group of artists that were like pre-Raphaelites, and just right around that time, I think it like is the turn of the century, maybe coming into the 20th century. Just before the 20th century, there was this group of very realistic artists who tried to make their paintings as beautiful as they could. Everything was about beauty. And
Right.
so this whole show was about this beauty. And when you look at these paintings, honestly, they're so beautiful that you're just transported. But the focus of the beauty is on how beautiful the painting quality is, how beautiful the people are in the paintings, how beautiful the scenes are. The beauty transports you in a sense, but there's no sense of the transcendence in the beauty. So by the time I got to the end of the show, I felt like a kid who had eaten too much candy, or I felt like I
Right.
had too much alcohol. I was like
Right.
kind of drunk with pleasure in a way that felt very unnatural.
Right.
And so I think that even the aesthetic sense can get overused or overplayed.
Sure. Yes, I think that's true. And that definitely relates directly to the point that we were talking about. I think that was like sort of like some of the more indulgent aspects of romanticism kind of veered off into that direction too. And I would say, if I were to try to pinpoint it, I would say that it is the focus of beauty the focus on beauty without realization of its transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes simply the material beauty.
It becomes self-referential.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah, it's a closed system. It's not an icon. It becomes the idol. And
that's the perfect
think,
language. It is idol versus icon. That's exactly the right way of putting it.
And it's interesting to me that natural beauty always somehow avoids that. Like,
Yep.
There's something about it that is always gesturing upwards, or I don't know how to describe it, but
it's because of the genuine sense of awe that even the most hardened atheist cannot avoid sometimes in experiencing nature. It's that awe, and the thing about that is that it because it's always rooted. There's always humility associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's never like whereas that sort of corrupted like worship of beauty that characterized like the worst aspects of romanticism, like Karen was kind of referencing, that it doesn't have that. There's no, it's kind of like, look at me, look at what I can do, isn't this pretty? And it doesn't have that sense of awe that we can get out of the beauty in nature, that kind of like is necessarily rooted in humility, because we know we can't do this. This is beyond our capacity. We can't imitate this. We can only appreciate it.
Yeah.
But here's another thing I'll throw in here is when I lived in Japan, I used to go to these big, beautiful parks in Japan. They have really beautiful parks. They'll have a big park that's as big as, say, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, acres and acres and acres park. Every single tree, whether it's large or small, every blade of grass is perfectly manicured. All of the trees are perfectly trimmed so that the shape is aesthetically as beautiful as it can possibly be. And the first time I saw it, I'm like, wow, this is so cool. Why aren't the parks like this in America? After I'd lived there for 3 years, I was longing to see some branch out of place, some twig doing its own thing, you know? And when I came back here and walked into a park where all of the trees are just doing their glorious, crazy thing, you know, it's like, oh, this is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
So there's something else about that when we're too focused on all the details. And I think this happens with art too. When a person gets too focused on following the rules and making sure everything is precise, you completely lose the, like you were saying, Michael, this idea of being able to see through into another realm, right?
Yeah. I think a part of it is that idea of non-identical repetition. I think you may have referenced earlier, and there's something about that it interrupts that self-referential cycle. It's a I forget who, I think it was Jess and Luke were having this conversation about the God who interrupts, who is on the Randos channel.
Yeah, I think so.
And there was something about that was really right. There's a sort of interruption to the process, right? And that really natural beauty seems to always have that quality of, like you were saying, Nate, of awe. That does necessarily provide with it humility and gratitude, versus, I know exactly what Karen was referring to when she was talking about this sense of kind of junk food, because you get it anytime you engage with social media.
Oh gosh, yeah.
You know, it kind of unintentionally pulls you into this sort of like this maelstrom of like little junk bits of you know, of this stuff. And I don't know what the, I was thinking earlier, there's a difference between a beauty that you desire to possess and one in which you want to come into union with. And I'm not sure how to tease out the differences, but there's something there in that.
And one that's, that you know is beyond you. It's like, even like, here's the thing. It's like when you have like a real experience of beauty in nature, I don't care what your professed beliefs are, you are going to have the experience of something that is entirely beyond you and transcendent. So, I mean, and that's why, I mean, this is why, to me, it's like the presence of God in nature is obvious, and everyone experiences it, regardless of what their propositional belief system says that they do.
Well, that happens not only when you're in the midst of beautiful nature, but if you're in the midst of a powerful storm or in the midst of waves crashing up and sweeping people away into the ocean.
Maybe even more so.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
You know, you're in the presence of something that is so radically bigger than you are that you have to acknowledge it.
Yeah, you can certainly rationalize your experience and explain it as like a product of evolutionary biology, whatever, but you cannot, the experience is the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
you know, if go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mike.
I was just gonna say, if I was a social scientist or something like this, you know, I think an interesting experiment would be take a bunch of people that live in the city, take them out into the middle of nowhere where there's no light pollution, and have them spend like a month where every night they go out and look at the stars. And I think if you did a before and after snapshot of what their beliefs about reality, they would be significantly altered in that month-long process.
I think so.
And it's funny because you think, well, because I think, you know, in our modernist frame, you think, well, that shouldn't make a difference about real reality. Like we have this disconnect between the physical world and quote unquote reality.
We disconnect
That,
our thought from our experience entirely. It's like
you know,
we won't pay any heed to our act. We want to discount our experience because we think that our experience is going to cause us to be diluted. Modernity and postmodernity are completely obsessed with the potential of being deceived and tricked and conned and fooled, and will never just accept things as they are. Which is which is basically a lack of acceptance of gift and a lack of gratitude.
yeah, that was well put. That was very concise.
Well, I'd like to throw a different angle on that, and that is that I was thinking about this after my conversation with Jess yesterday. Well, I think he and I even talked about it a little bit, or it might have been an earlier conversation. That we can have these conversations about theology, and I get done with this conversation, I feel so good, and I feel like I'm so centered, and I really, you know, love the Lord, and I'm just so thankful for you guys and all the things that we're learning. And then I walk out of this room and I go have a real encounter with a real person, and all my selfishness rises up to the
Yep.
surface, and all of my frustration, or maybe my judgment or my criticism, critical spirit or whatever. And then that's where the rubber hits the road. Am I going to live these things that we've been talking about, or am I going to live this other thing in me that is there? And we have to have those encounters. We have to. So chaos is not just when you fall into some tragedy or trauma. Chaos is every next moment. Every moment that we face is chaos. And that's where all the unknown is. It's where all the unknown information is. It's where all the potential problems exist. And they're all right there in the next moment.
Yeah, that's right. And we just have to do the best that we can to ask ourselves, like, you know, what is the best course of action in this moment? And you know what? We're going to continue to get it wrong, and we're going to continue to screw it up, and God will continue to love us anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part is that trust in the author to get it right, so that you can participate in the story. Because if it ultimately relies on you, you can take this perspective of I'm gonna sit over here and I'm gonna do all the math, all the arguments, etc., to get it right, and then I'll participate, and you just can't do that.
Well, it also presumes that you even know what's right for you, that you even know what's best for you, which is like, that's more presumptuous than we realize. It's like, do you really? You know, do you really?
Well,
So
I think the thing that saves us from falling over just into cheap grace, though, is that reality does exist. And so if I'm walking forward and I think, oh, well, it doesn't really matter what I do because God loves me and he's gonna make things okay for me anyway. Well, no, there are certain things that I can do because reality actually exists. I can make mistakes that are catastrophic for me. So I do have to pay attention. I have to think about things. I This is an old story, which many people probably weren't even alive when this happened, which tells you how old I am. But I was a great fan of Keith Green when I first became a Christian, and I loved his music and heard him in concert once. And so in I believe it was 1982 when he died in that plane crash. In my mind, I'm like, well, how could this happen? He had so much to give. And he loved the Lord so much, and there are so many people who still needed to learn what he had to teach, and all these questions are in my mind. And then I had this sudden realization: gravity is what gravity is, and if you overload a small plane and you have put too many people in it, which he did, gravity is what gravity is. So we still come up against reality in every moment, and so that means you have to always be processing your faith through what is the right thing to do in the next moment, not just, oh yeah, well, I'm safe in the arms of Jesus, so it doesn't really matter what I do. that's right. You know, if I go down in the plane, because it doesn't really matter what I do, I will still be with the Lord in heaven, but maybe he had some more plans for me here on earth, that if I had made a different choice based on reality, I would still be here.
Yes, I entirely agree with that. That's exactly right. And I think like here's how I would express that is that one should not be merely content with the good. Like that's not the object of our desire isn't merely the good. It is the perfect, and there are gradations of good. You can always have the better later. And just because the choice that you made was a good choice doesn't mean that the choice you made was the best choice. And you may not even have been able to make even have been able to make a choice other than what you made at the moment, and you may have made the best choice available to you, but it wasn't necessarily the best choice possible. So it's not, we should never be fully satisfied. There's not there I don't see any room for that. We should always be striving for more, while
Agree.
realizing we're going to fail at the same time.
Well, I think, yeah, you have to, that failure is really important because it is a part of the process. And I think as you move from good to better to best, you like all this, I think there's a sort of the cost incurred from going from like one level to the next gets more and more. And so it guarantees that you're gonna screw up something in that process. That doesn't mean you shouldn't take it on still.
And you're only going to get better by challenging yourself,
Yeah.
like in anything, right? And that applies to virtue as much as it does to anything else. It applies to virtue as much as it does to skill. You're only going to get better by overcoming more and more challenging situations.
Further up and further
So,
in.
yeah, further up and further in. That's exactly it. Yes.
And,
Yes. And what I like about that is it suggests that even at the end of history, it's not over. That we still haven't reached the end of it.
and I think the other thing is that because of what we learn through suffering, and I think it's in Corinthians, it says that in our sufferings, he comforts us with the comfort that we will be able to comfort others with. That's the same thing in our striving for virtue. We learn something, we're able to reach back and help the next person come up alongside of us, and they're able to help the next person come up alongside of them. So as we're going further up and further in, we're always reaching back and trying to help others to join us and to keep moving along this path. And there may be times that we fall off completely, just crash and burn, and have to get back on again. And those people will be reaching back to us and helping us back on and back up.
Yeah, we need to learn how to be with others in their suffering as God is with us in ours.
Yeah.
And that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it sure is. There've been times after I've gone through intense suffering that I was afraid to go and be with others in their suffering, because I was afraid it would just bring everything back up for me again. And so there were times when I would avoid being there for people, which I look back on with a lot of regret. But you know, with years and wisdom, I think I've learned a little bit about just being able to sit there and be with people. They don't need to have any answers. They just need somebody there with them.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And in fact, it's like that's really that not feeling the need to have the answers is such a big thing. And it's so hard for us because it's like we want to have the answers. We want to have the answers to everything. And for us to like be able to accept that we don't have answers is very tough.
Well, sometimes that want to have the answers comes out of a sincere desire to want to help the other person.
Sure.
I want to help you. I don't know how to help you. Maybe I'm seeing that you're in this misery and this pain because you're making mistakes, and I want to help you out of that, but I can't steal away your agency to learn what you have to learn in the midst of your own struggle.
Yeah, and it's a very delicate process it's a very delicate thing to navigate, as to know like when when to give advice and when to just like be with someone. It's very very hard.
Mm,
It's very very hard.
yep. Do you have some last words, Michael?
Oh, I don't think so. I think we covered most of. I think one of the things I thought about recently was, is it better to be good and look bad, or be bad and look good? And I think something of what this modern post frame, it's brought to the fore that it's all there, because there's the nullity at the heart of things, right? It's better to just look good, because you don't, and be bad, because in some sense we don't really know what good and bad is anyway at the heart of it. So best to just kind of have this sort of appearance level of good that has kind of driven, and so I think, I see that really deeply in myself, and so there's but there's a huge deception in that, right? Because um and I think that's something that we pick up a lot of times, where someone's they want to look good, but they don't really want to put in the self-sacrificial effort to be good. And I don't know, it's just really tough. Like, I don't know, because every time I become aware of that, it's because I also see that same thing working in me, and how do you
Yeah,
counter?
I thought, oh, he's talking about me again.
Or me, or anyone really.
Well, yeah, even
You
that thing what
know,
you're talking about with having the answers, is it's a way of getting that kind of shortcut to, like, oh, I can articulate the Christian faith really well. So obviously me and Jesus are like this,
yeah,
Um,
right.
yeah. So yeah, it's just it's tough. It is really tough. And
And I love George Jones, but that whole me and Jesus mentality is like part of the problem too, though, right? Because it's not like we're a community.
yeah,
You're not you are neither supposed to you aren't supposed to try to do it on your own.
yeah. No, yeah, I
You're
totally
not
agree.
you're not.
So the way you said that, Michael, was, is it better to be good and look bad? Or is it better to be bad and look good? Is that correct phrasing?
Yeah.
Well, so you were talking about it from the standpoint of putting on a mask, putting on a face, pretending to behave in a certain way.
Well, I'm also, in the way I was trying to frame it, was also presupposing that in some sense we don't really know what those things are. But I probably have in a lot of instances, I probably have a better idea about what people around me think it will look good than I do about what's actually good. So it's an easier problem to solve for it as well.
Oh, you mean adjusting your behavior to the people around?
Yeah. So like in any given time, you're kind of prioritizing one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I was also contemplating when I was thinking about that, as you take on bigger responsibility, the likelihood that you're going to be doing the right thing but still not look good goes up dramatically. And I was thinking as well that, in some sense, God ultimately is the one who experiences the most, where he's doing the ultimate level of self-sacrifice and good, and still there's some that he looks bad to, because they're not looking through the appearances.
Well, we also now have a culture that will go after people who are trying to do good.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like, because it actually has the capability of enraging people now. It's like they don't really care about whether you're trying to do good or not. What they care is whether you're aligning with, with
Well, they're also
with
cherry
their narrative
picking.
about reality.
Well, they're also cherry picking what's easy to cherry pick within a very, very narrow frame, like something that you could literally decide within seconds. So you could have somebody that's like a Mother Teresa, like their whole life, and has given their life and their body and their riches to the poor, and then a moment on Twitter uses the wrong pronouns, and they don't, there's this incapacity to see that entire frame. It's this, all that doesn't matter because of what I can see in this narrow slice of time. And that's what I'm going to bring that up the flagpole to the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah, and even Mother Teresa herself has been attacked by by people who misread what she talks about, how she talks about suffering, because they don't have any understanding of what the Catholic understanding of suffering is. So they read it out of context without like trying to understand the actual theological tradition that she's speaking out of, and just make it seem like she's some kind of horrible monster.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah. So literally, I mean, it's like anyone. And it's got to the point where it's so perverse, it seems like almost like the more virtuous someone is trying to be, the more likely they are to have some sort of petty attack leveled against them. So
I think
look at Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. Well, and I want to bring it down to a very mundane part of life, and that is one of my besetting sins is that I have the capacity to look in a messy junk drawer and imagine what it would look like if it were organized, and have the thought, it would be a good thing if I organized this junk drawer, and then to walk away from it and just leave it the way it is, because I saw what it would look like organized, and yeah, that's good. And that was kind of enough for the moment, right? But if I'm actually going to organize the junk drawer, and now I'm going to have to go do it because we talked about it. If I'm actually going to organize it, when I do that, I have to take it out of the cabinet and I have to empty it all out and spread the pieces all out. And then I have to start making a lot of decisions about, am I going to keep this or not keep this? If whatever I do keep, how am I going to organize it so that it's useful and productive? And that not only requires time, it requires space, it requires kind of an openness of thinking, and it requires some logic. It requires a whole lot of things that are part of like remodeling a house, is a much bigger picture of it. But we're always in this procedure of being remodeled constantly. We're in this remodeling thing. And if we mistake that somehow it should be something that's perfectible by just finding one little thing and fixing that one little thing, and now you're perfect, right? I could look in that junk drawer and, oh, there's a pencil out of place. I can take that pencil out of there and get rid of it, and now my drawer is perfect. No, it still requires the remodeling. So I think there's something about the culture warriors on both sides that have a deep misunderstanding of what it means to be remodeled. They're just looking for the one little thing they can find that's wrong, and then fix that, and then bingo, no more worry about sin or imperfection or anything else.
Yeah, it's that modern myth of progress without the costs, which always, I mean, it's happening whether you like it or not. You're even at a cellular level, this death and rebirth is going on. So you might as well take that process and put it towards some good.
Did you see the comment somebody made on my conversation with Jess? It's just the conversation with Jess just published today, and someone made the comment, progressivism is, we were talking about learning to ride a bike as being a participatory activity. And someone made the comment, progressivism is like a bicycle without brakes, and conservatism is like a bicycle without pedals. And both of them together, I don't remember what the context was of the both of them together, but if you get whatever the error is at the heart of, if they're both heading off in the wrong direction, which is what's happening right now, right? That's like a bicycle without handlebars.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the world looks like to us right now, is a bicycle without handlebars, because we're heading somewhere, but who knows? No.
Which I would say brings us right back to where we started, which is that like that emptiness at the heart of all things without the transcendent. Because both of the camps they're looking toward the imminent only for salvation. There's no turn toward there's no transcendent turn. It's just like, if we can just make the state look like the way we want it to look,
Mhm.
then everything will be fine. So that missing of transcendence is what causes them to go off into those extremes.
Well, isn't that ultimately what happens? If there's a nullity at the center of everything, then you have to have the state at the center. Because even if you say, no, we're going to make the anarchic individual at the center, the ultimate result of that is always that the state comes back to the center. So
yeah, right, because it becomes a narrative about freedom that becomes reducible to a narrative of power.
yes.
And yes, it will end up devolving into totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Either way, pick. I mean, either way, left or right. It's like, which, and I also think that both of these extremes are like, even though members of both of these factions can keep the name of Jesus on their lips, there's a fundamental neo-paganism that is driving what they're doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is gets to that about the modernism arising out of this sort of necrophobia that eventually manifests as a necrophilia.
Yes. Because it's wanting to contain all the answers within that finite frame. It's like it's that pursuit of, like, avoidance of suffering and unlimited pleasure, and the reduction of everything to the finite, and the desire to extend life and separate life from death, that ends up making death the center of everything.
Yeah. So for those who so we hadn't mentioned this before in the video today, but we've been talking offline about an article. Was that by Catherine Pickstock?
No, it was referencing Catherine Pickstock's after writing. One of the things that she talks about in after writing is this notion that both modernity and postmodernity like have this like avoidance of death that ends up having a necrophilic turn, like where it ends up like by having this obsessive avoidance of death, it ends up celebrating death and misunderstanding the nature of life. And
it attempts to extend life by it attempts in attempting to get rid of death. It takes all the quote unquote dirty stuff out of life to the point where life no longer is life. It kind of enshrines death within life.
And the author of that piece then references C.S. Lewis's the third of his science fiction novels, That Hideous Strength, where the evil organization NICE is trying to like create artificial immortality and get rid of all that dirty biological life that's so imperfect and that we can improve upon through our progress.
I saw what I think is a perfect visual of this on Twitter yesterday. There's a African woman who writes beautifully about pro-life issues, and she had reposted a tweet that she saw of a young woman who was making the statement, I've had 5 abortions, but I love my babies. I keep them with me always. And she had this long piece of like plastic, and embedded in the plastic were 5 little fetuses about this big, little babies that she had saved her aborted babies and had preserved them somehow so that she can keep them with her. That's where we're headed if we keep going down this direction.
Well, there's this way in which both modernity and postmodernity, as I see it, they end up ultimately turning the person into an object, because the idea of the objective, this sort of like objective sense of self that's just like defined in these absolute terms. It's kind of like it tries to do the same thing with the self that the scientist is doing with the butterfly, right? Because what you actually are as an individual self is a relational being that can only truly exist as a person in relation to other persons who are also relational beings, interrelating with the entire created cosmos, and everything is relational towards everything else. That's how you truly exist as a person. And trying to have this sort of like fixed state notion, the sort of absolute notion of the person, turns the person into an object, as dead as that butterfly on the scientist's, you know, corkboard.
So when you're talking about the absolute notion of a person, are you talking about like what happens in identity politics when a person gets intersectionalized?
I think
down
what he's
to
talking
this
about even is the
person?
fabric of what the soul is, right? I mean, that's what I heard what you were saying. Like even like at a fundamental conceptual nature, what the components of your very being are.
I would say it's
At
a, right. Yeah, I would say that it's like the minute you conceive like the minute you conceive of a sort of Cartesian self, cogito ergo sum, it's like you actually have lost your true self because you are not, you are so much more than just like whatever you perceive to be the internal ongoings of your mind.
Mhm.
And that does relate to the identity politics thing too. You're right, Karen, because it's like, yeah, it's like you don't, you know, it's like you're not this, you're not that, you're not your identity. You're so much more than that. You are this complex of relations. Like if I would not be, I would literally not be the person that I am in this moment had I not met you and Karen. I'm a different person in this moment than I would have been had I never met you.
Mhm.
Other people we interact with, all the other ideas we interact with, all the other things we interact with in the world, they all participate in making us who we are. And that is never it's never ever fixed at any point in time. It's always continually evolving. And the attempt to try to fix that in some absolute sense actually fundamentally kills what it actually means to be alive.
I was engaged with this article today by it was about Hannah Arendt's on the origins of totalitarianism, and the article was drawing out how she had pointed to loneliness being a sort of precondition for totalitarianism, in that what in this sort of isolation of the self we lose the capacity to actually think, that that we become I have to it's a sort of complex argument, but there's a sort of enslavement to a stasis in the conception of the self, in that loneliness that makes it willing to be impregnated with this ideology, because it no longer has the capacity to see the ways in which the ideology doesn't really map onto reality, because it's no longer has the capacity to think about reality anymore.
Right, because it's less messy. Because it's like it gives you like this like it gives you this false notion of what you are that is just so much simpler than actually like engaging with the almost infinitely layered complexity that actually is your life. It just reduces it down to something. It's like, okay, I am this. This is what I am. It's
That's
like,
at the very heart of addiction. That's
yes,
exactly the heart
that's
of addiction.
exactly right.
Right? It works the
Which is
same
sin,
way with this
which
alcohol or
is
food or any of those things is,
which is sin,
yes.
which is sin. That is the fundamental nature of sin. That's absolutely 100% right.
Yeah, it's this progressive narrowing. Your vision is narrowed, your life is narrowed down to this one thing that makes sense to you, is the only thing that's keeping you, you know, that one thing. You're just stuck in that hole. Because I can
Yep.
get there sometimes with food, and I can feel the, you know, now that I know this is, oh yeah, that's the addiction. It's just this
Yeah, me
narrowing.
too. Me too. That's my own personal like addiction. It's like, you know, it's like,
Yeah.
heck, this lockdown I've gained like probably like 50 pounds, you know. So yeah. So that, yeah, when I'm not well, that's what I turn to. So
And it comes out of loneliness. I mean, they
yeah.
did studies on rats that the rats that are addictable are the ones that don't have fellowship. But if you put the rats into a community of other rats and they get to play together and have fun together, they never overeat.
Yep.
So it does, it comes down to loneliness.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you know, as you know, we can be lonely even when we're in a crowd. We can be lonely
Mhm.
when we have deep friendships online. We can still be lonely because that loneliness, if I really think about it, that loneliness is in me. It's when I am unwilling to open myself up to the Lord. Maybe I'm frustrated about something, or I had a bad conversation with somebody and I feel stupid, or, you know, whatever it is. I could just go and talk to the Lord about it. It would be easy enough because he's always there and he loves me. But there's a thing in me that just rocks right over that thought and just goes right over and grabs a handful of peanuts, or, you know, just goes right over and says, oh, I'll just have an apple. That's not that big a deal. Well, I mean, if you start adding up just this and just that,
Just that. Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
big
It
deal.
balloons. Yeah.
But at
Yeah.
the heart of it, it's always, I don't want to open that space. I don't want to yield. You know,
Yeah.
we
Because
are
it's,
complex creatures.
yep. I think that's good. That's
Maybe
very
that's a good
good.
place to end.
I think so. I think that is like the perfect note to end on. Is like, hey, people are complicated. Just deal with it.
Yeah, I think the bodies are an important part of how we are complicated, and all their
Yes.
particularity, their strangeness. God's identification with that is key in all this, and I think we forget that. We say, okay, you know, this body thing, I don't really need to take that care of it. You know, like there's a sense in which it's kind of like it's that Gnostic thing you were talking about, where it's like, this is just this dirty thing I don't really need to worry about because, you know, I'm going to heaven one day.
And he is the thing that provides for the possibility of unity within that multiplicity, because we're all created in his image.
Yep. And he's always calling us forward, the high calling of God in Christ Jesus.
Amen.
Amen. Good talking to you guys.
Yeah. Great talk. Thank you.
I'll see you next week. We'll do number
See-
7. Maybe we'll have to have some kind of celebration when we get to the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Great conversation. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.